حدثنا محمد بن عبيد الله قال حدثنا عبد العزيز بن أبي حازم عن أبيه عن أبي حازم عن سهل بن سعد رضي الله عنه قال Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The book that we want to discuss and share with you today is a very interesting work, which is called The Case of Israel. The Case of Israel by R. Garaldi. A study of political Zionism, printed by Shuruk International. R. Garaldi, The Case of Israel, a study of political Zionism. Roger Garaldi, I hope that I pronounced his name correctly, was born in Marseilles in 1913. He joined the French army in 1939, but in 1940 he was detained in a Vichy concentration camp in Algeria until his release in 1943. Elected to the National Assembly in 1945, he later served as deputy speaker and senator. Since 1962, he has devoted himself to university teaching and his writings on political theory and the philosophy of civilizations. For many years, one of France's leading Marxist theoreticians, he has become increasingly attracted to Islamic teachings and civilization, and in 1982 became a Muslim. In this study, which is equally critical of anti-Semitism and political Zionism, he considers the fundamental problems presented by the policies of the State of Israel. He examines the question of historical continuity between the biblical land of Israel and the present Zionist state, and he considers the claim of the Zionists that God's promise to Abraham implies their divine right over Palestine. This leads him to an analysis of the Zionist basis of Israel's domestic and foreign policies, and concludes with a constructive proposal for peace in the Middle East, based on all UN resolutions, including the original 1947 decision on the partition of Palestine to be internationally guaranteed. Okay. The book was first published in France by SPAG or SPAG, Papyrus or Papyrus Editions, Paris 1983, copyright SPAG 1983. This translation, first published in Great Britain by Shuruk International 1983, reprinted in 1985, copyright Shuruk International UK Limited 1983, all rights reserved. Alright, then we have the contents. Forward to the English edition, A Religious Zionism and Political Zionism, Zionism and Judaism, the Israel of the Bible and the Present Zionist State of Israel. Part 1, The Historical Myth, the Myth of Historic Rights, the Biblical Myth. Part 2, From the Zionist Mythology to the Politics of Israel, International Policy, Racism, Israel as a Colonial Entity, Israel's Foreign Policy, Expansionism, the Methods of Israel's Policy, State Terrorism. Conclusion, Index. And then we have forward to the English edition. There have been many books on this subject, favorable and hostile, but never neutral even when claiming to be. And no doubt there will be many more. But now that one of France's leading intellectuals has made an important contribution to its discussion, it is wholly right that it should be made available in English. Roger Garaldi does not profess neutrality. In brief, he believes that Israel's statehood, its famous right to exist, which the Palestinian Arabs are called upon to recognize, is based on a gigantic fraud. In his words, it possesses no legitimacy, historical, biblical, or juridical, and the place where it was established. For him, political Zionism was born barely a century ago with Theodor Herzl and his book Der Judenstaat, and both a perversion and betrayal of religious Zionism and the true spiritual mission of Judaism, which Garaldi extols. Herzl's followers either cynically or sincerely, but always ruthlessly exploited what Garaldi calls the historical myth and the biblical pretext for the seizure of Palestine and the expulsion of its inhabitants. I remember once asking an eminent Israeli diplomat and scholar what he considered to be the basis of Israeli diplomacy. He replied, quite simple, the Old Testament. The fact that, like Herzl, he was a convinced non-believer, or that Israel's diplomacy might have to be conducted among Hindus or pagans who have no particular regard for the Old Testament, did not strike him as a difficulty. I.e., what if a person is an atheist? I don't believe in God, a person says. There's no such thing as Old or New Testament. I don't believe in any promise to Abraham, so on and so forth. What do you say to that person with regards to the legitimacy of that land? And violently removing, killing, raping, maiming, displacing the people who have lived there for centuries. For argument's sake, the original inhabitants, for argument's sake, were these Jewish people. They were expelled. It was their land. All right, no problem. But we all can agree that these people have been living here in this place, whether you call it Palestine, whatever you want to call it. Everybody can agree that this sofa, this couch in my house, it was my grandmother's. Historically. This was my great-grandfather's farm. It's historic. You have to give me that land. Your couch is no longer yours. Your house is no longer yours because of the Old Testament. Okay, but sir, I don't believe in the Old Testament. Then what? So he's saying that those people who make that the basis of their legitimacy, they gave it no thought or any care that there are other people of other faiths and religions who have no regard or acceptance of Old or New Testament. So that's very interesting crux of the entire discussion. God promised this land. Okay, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. What's next? And this is without any question one of the major causes for what we have seen and what we're seeing. Moving forward, he then states, Golda Meir dismissed the problem with her customary briskness when she said, this country exists as a result of a promise made by God himself. It will be ridiculous to ask for the recognition of its legitimacy. Ridiculous. God gave us this land. How dare you question or fact check or demand any other means of legitimacy? This is God. God promised. Okay, no problem. Well, this dictator, this conqueror, this emperor, this whatever name or title that he has, he slaughters thousands, millions of people. And what did he say? God told me. The gods told me. My God told me that I had the right to conquer the entire world and to slaughter anyone who got in my way. So where does the world go when a person comes along and legitimizes their claim with what God said? As extremely reckless and dangerous. Extremely reckless and dangerous. God told me that I could take your property. Do you submit to what God said? We all know how that's going to turn out. Moving forward, it would be ridiculous to ask for the recognition of its legitimacy. Ridiculous to even ask for the legitimacy of the state of Israel just because God promised it. Roger Garaldi refuses to accept such assertions. He argues that we are entitled to question whether this was really his intention when his commands have been relayed to us, often in a contradictory and unconvincing manner by the very people who claim to be the beneficiaries of his will. Moreover, even supposing God did make the promise, he doubts whether those who rule Palestine today are their true heirs. Thus, he analyzes what he calls the myth of historic rights, in addition to the biblical myth. All right, moving forward. Much mentioned, and this is quoted by Peter Mansfield. Then the actual author's introduction, he says, and the book's about 169 pages. Okay, we are tackling a forbidden subject, Zionism and the state of Israel. In France, you can criticize Catholic dogma or Marxism, attack atheism or nationalism, condemn the regimes of the Soviet Union, the United States, or South Africa, preach anarchism or monarchism, all without running any risks beyond the usual ones of getting involved in a polemic or being refuted. If, however, you undertake to analyze Zionism, you enter into a different world. You pass from the realm of literature and to that of the law courts, by virtue of a law of 29 July 1881, which very properly forbids the defamation of any person on account of his belongings to a particular ethnic group, race, nation, race, or religion. Any criticism of the policy of the State of Israel and of the political Zionism, which its basis renders you liable to prosecution. Fundamental criticism of the State of Israel, and by fundamental I mean criticism not of the individual actions, even criminal ones, but analysis of the inner logic of a state based upon principles of political Zionism, causes you to be treated forthwith as a Nazi, and brings upon you threats against your life. The author of this essay can bear witness to this fact, having himself experienced for this reason prosecution, the charge of Nazism, and threats of death. So let's just stop and put it on pause what the author is trying to say. You can say bad things about God in France and in other parts of the world. You can say religion is a bunch of hocus pocus. It's a bunch of nonsense. The Pope is demented, twisted, megalomaniac, searching for power. You can criticize the Soviet Union. You can talk about this leader, that ruler. But the one off-limits topic that you cannot discuss without being threatened, canceled, criticized, attacked, labeled is Zionism. So that is once again extremely dangerous, and which is just one off-limits topic, subject, or people, or matter of discussion, but it isn't God Almighty. Don't you find that a little perverse? Just a little perverse? That this topic is totally off limits, but everything else is free game. What are you hiding? What are you afraid of? What's the problem? Why can't we have a political discussion? Israel is a sovereign state, just like Nicaragua, El Salvador, just like Egypt, just like Australia, just like Nigeria. What would be the difference? So the fact that speaking on Israel, its policies, its practices, its actions of the individuals, let alone of the state, as he said, its inner logic, is something in France, and of course we can for sure relate to that here in the United States, even though we may have a little more freedom, we may have a little more wiggle room or maneuvering room, but for sure one of the fastest and easiest ways of getting canceled, censored, blackballed, fired is by mentioning anything which is anti-Israel or anything even critical, just demanding, asking a question, and fact-checking will get you censored and canceled. Let alone in some European countries in which there are certain things that pertain to Jews as a race, or an adherence of a religion, or anything pertaining to their plight, Holocaust, anything like this is illegal. To even have a scientific discussion is illegal. That's something that I think each and every single person living in the modern world today should be at least concerned about, let alone disturbed, and which there is a chance and an opportunity for someone to present to you and impose upon you a belief, an acceptance, and the following of a narrative. And then that person has no personal, individual investments whatsoever. These are the facts. Once you allow them, once you open up that door, there will be literal chaos in the world, hence chaos being in the world. Okay, so the author is a very long introduction in which he talks about his work. He talks about the different myths, lies, the different crimes, the different offenses, the different inaccuracies of Israel as a state, as a whole, let alone those done by some of its leaders, prime ministers, politicians, representatives, members of its army, generals, etc. Okay, so part one is the historical myth, i.e. the myth of the right of return, and the myth of we were here first and we've come back. Regardless, is that moral or immoral? There are Jews living in Palestine that were there, Christians, Muslims, Druzes, people of other faiths and denominations, the concept that people, whether they're Jews or not, from another part of the world, can now come and reclaim and take and possess under the claim that this was originally ours 1,000 years ago. Allahu Alam, how long? Because when we start talking about history, the Roman Empire, the different calendars, things can become very hairy and sticky with regards to exact dates matching up. So just the idea of, I'm not usurping, I'm not stealing, I'm just coming back. I'm going to West Africa and I'm taking over what was once mine. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather used to live here. I've returned to reclaim his house, regardless of how long you've been living there. Is that right or wrong? Is that accurate or inaccurate? That's not the point. But the moral of the story is, he says that the basis of that argument is a lie. There is no return. You were never here. You never lived here. This promise, these people claiming that they're returning, he, the author, criticizes that from the get-go. He sweeps his legs. He sweeps his legs. And obviously, if you get rid of that promise and that right of return, then there are 20 other issues which are easily moved to the side, according to the author. Okay, let's mention a few quotes here from the book. Let's go to page 35. Far from being the first occupiers of Palestine, the Hebrews were but one component among many others in the mixture of peoples in the Fertile Crescent. They have no grounds for claiming an exceptional place in this long history. Political Zionism engages in a systematic manipulation and misinterpretation of the facts when in Israeli school books, as in propaganda for the outside world, it retains as significant for the history of Palestine only those few moments when the Hebrews played a certain role, namely the occupation of Canaan by the tribes in Joshua's time, which the 10th century biblical texts date to the 13th century BC. This penetration was transformed, moreover, into a holy war, etc. So, for argument's sake, these people who are returning to these lands that were promised to them by God Almighty, but were they only promised to them by God? No one else was living there? No one else inhabited those lands? What if people from other parts of the world, of other faiths, say, my grandfather of this century lived here, and this is the biblical text to prove it? What's meant by a Semite and Israel versus Hebrew? What were the different tribes? How many tribes were there? Are the Arabs not Semites? When we say that this is my original home and I've come back to take it, based off of this promise. Very interesting point. Then he says here, all the rest of Palestine's history is rubbed out, as though for 2,000 years, from the 3rd millennium until the coming of the Hebrews, nothing happened in that land. And then again, nothing for nearly 2 more millennia, from the end of the revolt of Bar Kokhba in 135 AD until the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. In this way, a primary historical myth has been created by retaining arbitrarily out of a history of 5,000 years only a few episodes, the migration among so many others of Hebrew tribes, the kingdom among so many others of David, or the revolts among so many others, or the Maccabees, or of Bar Kokhba. The history of Palestine that is taught in the schools of the State of Israel is the work of forgers, but the sacred history taught in the Catholic catechism or in Protestant Sunday schools, by sticking to the Bible and ignoring the actual history of the ancient East, unintentionally supports the propaganda of political Zionism and prepares millions of Christians throughout the world to accept as true a mythology that is deadly to the Palestinian people and to world peace. For this mythology serves to provide political Zionism with grounds for territorial demands, annexations, and aggressions. Then on page 37, the author says, the myth of the desert. When political Zionism became clearly formulated with Herzl's The Jewish State, 1896, the presence was left unmentioned both in Herzl's book and in the constituent assemblies of the World Zionist Movement, the non-existence of this people is one of the fundamental postulates of Zionism, and this is at the root of all its subsequent crimes. Mrs. Golda Meir said in the Sunday Times of 15 June 1969, there was no such thing as Palestinians. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people and we came and threw out and took their country from them. They did not exist. It was a barren land. We went there, it was nothing there. It was just a desert. The Jews were prosecuted by the Nazis and the other haters of Jews and anti-Semites. We had to run and flee for our safety and our love of being Jew and being Jewish and our religion, our identity. We want to change our names. We want to be close to God and our original promised land. And when we got to Palestine, it was, is anybody there? This is, who is Golda Meir? Do you know who she is? Do you know her significance, her symbolism, her relationship with the United States? This is at the top heads of the founding fathers of its establishment, and that's her rhetoric. It's not like we got rid of Palestinians. We didn't kick anybody out because they were never there. So if this is one of the top politicians, one of the earliest people saying this, imagine what the average 9-to-5 person in Israel thinks and feels. Moving forward, the author then states, if these Palestinians do not exist and yet resist, these absent but present people, absent but present, keyword, they weren't there, but now they're magically there fighting us, committing acts of terrorism and acts of anti-Semitism against Jews. Which one is it? No one was there, or there were some Arabs there and then they fought us and they didn't want us to take our rightful land. Which of the two? How can someone be absent but present? Author says, people must be either driven out or massacred, just as other immigrants in America dealt with the Indians. And this is one of the reasons why it is extremely flawed to run to the United States for help and support against the persecution and the terrorism and the plight of the Palestinian people in light of what's been happening, what is happening. Do you think they're going to help you out? That's the history of their country. They're savages. Or North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, Virginia, Georgia. There was nothing here. We got off the boat, we landed here, and it was a land full of bounty. No one lived there. And all of a sudden, magically, when this half-naked Mohawk savage came, saying, hey, get off my land, and we fought them back, then they made acts of terrorism against settlers. They raped a pure white Christian woman. The Indian savage, he stole a horse. And we all know the subsequent actions. So it's the same philosophy. The land was empty when I came. All of a sudden somebody popped up. Then we massacre them and we call them terrorists, anti-Semites, so on and so on and so forth. It's the same playbook. It's the same playbook. Moving forward, it states, when Einstein asked Weizmann, when the latter was one of the leaders of the World Zionist Organization, what of the Arabs if Palestine were given to the Jews? Weizmann replied, what Arabs? There are hardly of any consequence. What Arabs? What are you talking about? Professor Ben Zion Dinor, who was the first minister of education in the state of Israel and a close friend of the state's founder, David Ben-Gurion, wrote in 1954 in his introduction to the history of the Haganah. That's a very long discussion about the Haganah. Look it up, Google it. With regards to the founding fathers of terrorism and slaying civilians and placing bombs among civilians and non-combatants. Read the history of the Haganah and the Irgun, and then you'll realize that the Palestinian Arabs were not the trailblazers of terrorism and bombings. It was another people who started those acts. Moving forward, he says, in our country there is room only for the Jews. We shall say to the Arabs, get out. If they don't agree, if they resist, we shall drive them out by force. Can it be any more plain or any clearer than that? There's no room for two races here. And if you dare resist, we will tell you to get out. And if you don't get out, then we will use the might and the force. Moving forward, the author, he talks about all of these different numbers and dates, full of factual information here. Page 64. The underlying reason for this falsification of history by the Zionists is political. What they aim at is, by means of this exceptionalism, to separate the state of Israel from the international community and to establish with other communities or with the other countries not normal relations based on mutual understanding, common interests, and peaceful, creative purposes to be accomplished together, but exceptional relations of guilt, so that it will be enough to mention the Holocaust, taking this out of its entire historical context, for everything to be permitted to the exceptional victim, including the turning to profit of that massacre of earlier times, so that today the external aid received from the United States amounts to more than $750 per head of the population of Israel. That is twice the national income per head in the African countries. And what if the American Indians were to make the rest of the world pay in this way for the genocide of which they were the object? Or if the blacks of Africa were to claim repayment of the debt for the 100 million victims of the slave trade? So, what does away with anti-Semitism? And what supports and furthers anti-Semitism? The Jews are special and exceptional, or they're like anybody else. They're humans, they have ups, they have downs, they have feelings, they have different languages, they have cultural, etc. Or saying that they are exceptional, they're off limits, they're different. That is the founding cause of anti-Semitism. Is that the Jews who live in Germany aren't like the rest of the Germans. The Jews in the United States aren't true Americans. They're different, they're exceptional. So it's very interesting how a person is blinded and they end up falling to the very thing that they claim to run away from. So if this book was written all of those years ago, decades ago, $750 for every single Israeli citizen from the United States. Imagine how much it is in 2025. That is what the taxpayers and the donors and the benefactors, that's what they give, at least $750 each and every single month. Or every year, excuse me. All right, to sum things up, page 145, another interesting quote. By these figures, many legends are dispersed. In the first place, the most dangerous of them all, the legend of Little Israel, weak and perpetually under threat from an Arab tidal wave and doomed to fight for its survival. In fact, Israel possesses, thanks to the United States, the means of striking within 48 hours at Damascus, Baghdad, Amman, and Cairo, just as it has already struck at Beirut. The danger lies in the legend about Israel being constantly threatened with annihilation, whereas it is Israel that constitutes a standing threat of aggression against all of its neighbors. This is the legend thanks to which Western opinions puts up with everything and anything from Israel, even the most unacceptable of crimes. This was decades before the year-long massacre, some say genocide, whatever you wish to call it, post-October the 7th. That Israel is this little tiny, small, hiding country surrounded by so many menacing, vicious, hostile Arab states. When Israel possesses how many nuclear weapons, how many tanks, how many planes, how many billions of dollars do they get in military aid, just military aid. How vicious and ruthless, relentless is the Mossad. Yet and still they are the weak, harmless victim about to be swallowed whole by all of these angry, hostile, anti-Semite Arab states. That's the lie that is perpetuated. Moving forward, the author then states, or he says, this is the legend, all right, he says, of the permanent miracle of the so-called little David, face to face with the all-devouring Arab Goliath, whereas little David can load his sling with all the armaments and all the money of the United States. The Zionist state of Israel weighs upon the Middle East at the point where Europe, Asia, and Africa meet with all the weight of mighty America. Page 154. We must hit, and hit them incessantly. Continue to pound them. We must hit them everywhere in the country and the Arab states and overseas. It can be done. In this matter, I have already seen hopeless situations that have found a solution. We must not act against them after they hit us, but every day and everywhere. If I know they are in a certain country in Europe, we must do it despite all difficulties and limitations. Not by means of large-scale war. Suddenly someone disappears there. Someone is found dead here. And someone is found stabbed to death in a European nightclub. This statement was made by Ariel Sharon. Commit assassinations, sovereign lands, sovereign territories, commit acts of terror outside of the occupied West Bank, outside of the Gaza Strip, outside of Israel. We must pound them, terrorize them, slaughter them, kill them. And this is the statement of some random Israeli cab driver, some fanatical right-wing Ariel Sharon. What was his position? How long did he lead? How long was he in power? And that's his mindset. Moving forward, page 155. At the time of the murder of Wael Zuaitar, the socialist prime minister in office at the time, Miss Golda Meir made remarks similar to those of Ariel Sharon. When she was questioned in the Knesset on 18 October 1972, 48 hours after the murder, she replied, "All I know is that the bullets did indeed reach their target." That's all I know. Was it right? Was it justified? Was it on someone's soil? Was it in an embassy? I don't know. But I know that the bullets did hit their mark. And this enemy of ours is dead. That's food for thought. Food for thought. And the last thing I will say, you can read the book, you can check it out. I don't think that any intellectual or any person of a sound mind will realize or will disagree that these aren't words of a victim. These aren't words of a weak, helpless damsel in distress. These aren't the words of someone that's being afraid of being exterminated by 22, 21, 20 Arab countries. But these are words of someone who has a great deal of knowledge and confidence and the firepower that they hold. So, not October the 7th, after October the 7th, Palestine, two-state solution, etc., etc., Hamas, the hostages, etc. Check out the book, inshallah ta'ala. The Case of Israel, a study of political Zionism. Thank you very much for watching and for tuning in.